The thing about driving a truck through the lonely highways of Montana is that after a while, the road starts to feel like it belongs to you. Miles and miles of nothing but open fields, scattered trees, and the occasional ranch house. At night, it's even worse. No streetlights, barely any other vehicles, just the sound of your tires humming against the pavement and the faint glow of your dashboard. I had been on the road for over 10 hours, making my way east toward North Dakota with a cargo load of construction equipment. My company had miscalculated my fuel mileage, and the nearest approved station for refueling wasn't on my planned route. That meant I had to take an unfamiliar highway that cut through a remote part of the state. I wasn't too worried about it at first. Just another empty road, another couple of hours alone. But something about that stretch of highway felt off the moment I turned onto it. The night was pitch black. No moon, no stars, just an endless abyss stretching over the land like a thick, suffocating blanket. The road itself was narrow, cracked, barely maintained. My headlights illuminated the faded lines on the asphalt, and beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. For the first hour, I didn't see a single car. Not coming toward me, not in my mirrors. Just me, my rig, and the emptiness. Then, something appeared in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was just a pile of debris, maybe a dead deer, maybe a busted-up tire from another truck. I eased off the gas and let the truck coast forward, my eyes locked onto the shadowy mass lying across the asphalt. As I got closer, my stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I brought my rig to a slow stop about 20 feet from the thing. My headlights flooded it with light, and my breath caught in my throat. It was meat. At least, that's the only way I can describe it. A pile of flesh, stripped completely of fur or skin, with exposed bones jutting out at odd angles. The rib cage was unmistakable, large, human-sized. But there was no head, no limbs, just a torso, mangled and raw, glistening under the harsh glare of my headlights. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Roadkill? It had to be. But it didn't look like any roadkill I had ever seen. No fur, no hooves or paws, just meat. Fresh, too. Steam still rose from the torn muscle, meaning whatever happened to it had happened recently. I had two choices. I could drive around it, pretend I never saw it, and keep moving. Or I could step out and take a closer look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was wrong. And if there was even the slightest chance that it was a person, that maybe someone needed help, I had to check. So, against my better judgment, I reached for my flashlight, pulled on my jacket, and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit me like a slap. Even though my breath fogged up in the air, the overwhelming smell of iron and decay burned my nostrils. I walked forward slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel on the roadside. The closer I got, the more my stomach churned. It was bigger than I had thought, at least 4 feet long, maybe 5. The spine was still intact, but the head was missing entirely. The cuts along the bones were clean, too clean, not torn like an animal attack. These were precise, almost surgical. That's when I saw them, footprints, leading away from the body. The prints were deep, pressed into the cold, damp earth at the edge of the asphalt. Bare feet, human, the size of a grown man's, and they led into the woods. I swallowed hard. My flashlight beam followed the path, illuminating the twisted branches of the trees that lined the road. The footprints disappeared into the underbrush, vanishing into the darkness beyond. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just some unlucky animal that got hit by a truck. Someone, or something, had dragged this thing out here and left it in the middle of the road. And now, they were watching me. I felt it, that deep, crawling sensation along the back of my neck. The undeniable instinct that someone was standing just beyond the reach of my light, hidden in the trees, staring. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. My breath came in shallow gasps, my fingers tightening around my flashlight. Nothing. But that feeling wouldn't go away. I needed to leave. I backed away from the corpse, keeping my eyes on the woods, and hurried back to my truck. As soon as I was in the cab, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the rig into gear. My tires screeched against the pavement as I maneuvered around the body and sped down the highway. But as my headlights swept past the trees, I saw it. A figure, tall, too tall, standing just beyond the first row of trees. No clothes, no face, just watching. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I floored it, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop driving for hours. But the worst part? When I finally reached the gas station and checked my truck, I found something smeared along the bottom of the cab. Dark, wet, blood, and a single bare footprint pressed against the side of my trailer. I stood there staring at the bloody footprint on the side of my trailer, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. It wasn't a smudge. It wasn't road grime. It was a perfect, unmistakable bare footprint, too large to belong to a child, but not quite the size of a fully grown man's. The toes were long, unnaturally so, and the arch of the foot was higher than normal. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. My truck had been moving at least 60 miles per hour for the past 2 hours. Nothing, no one, could have clung to the side of the trailer at that speed. And yet, here was proof that something had been there. My gut twisted. The gas station was the first sign of civilization I had seen since I turned off the main highway. It was one of those small, old-school stops, just a single row of pumps, a convenience store, and a tiny diner attached to the side. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a couple of parked semis and an old rusted-out pickup truck. I glanced at the store's bright neon sign, flickering in and out as if it hadn't been maintained in years. I needed to tell someone, anyone, what I had seen. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had just been on the road too long. I locked up my rig and walked toward the store, my boots crunching against the icy pavement. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and immediately the warmth hit me, along with the faint smell of burnt coffee and something fried. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, barely glancing up as I entered. A single trucker sat in one of the booths near the window, sipping his coffee and staring down at a half-eaten plate of eggs. I made my way to the counter, forcing myself to swallow the dryness in my throat. "Everything okay, hon?" the woman asked, finally looking up. Her eyes flicked to my face, then down to my hands. I hadn't realized I was still shaking. I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I had just found a skinned corpse in the middle of the road? That something had watched me from the woods, too tall and too still to be human? That there was now a footprint on my truck from something that should not exist? I licked my lips, trying to steady my voice. Yeah, just a long drive," I muttered. "You guys get many accidents on this stretch of road?" She frowned, closing her magazine. "What do you mean?" I cleared my throat. I think I might have seen roadkill. Just something weird back there." She stared at me for a moment before slowly standing, her hands pressing against the counter. The trucker in the booth had gone still, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. I could feel both of them watching me now. "What stretch of road?" the woman asked. I gestured vaguely over my shoulder. "About 50 miles back, maybe more. Took the old highway in from the west." I hesitated. I stopped for a minute. It didn't look like a deer. Didn't look like anything I've seen before. The trucker exhaled sharply and set his fork down. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his stubbled face. The woman's expression darkened. "You should have just kept driving." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment, then glanced at the trucker, who shook his head. Finally, she sighed, lowering her voice. "People don't stop on that road." I stared at her. "Why?" The trucker let out a humorless chuckle. "Because things out there ain't meant to be looked at, driver." I felt my stomach drop. "What the hell does that mean?" The woman leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "That stretch of road? It's been bad for a long time. People see things. People lose things out there. There's stories. Stories about things standing in the woods, things that call your name. They say it starts with something wrong in the road. You stop, you look at it, and then something sees you back." I swallowed hard. "Has anyone ever—" "Some folks don't come back," she interrupted. "Others come back different." I wanted to laugh, to tell her this was just some stupid local legend, a ghost story truckers tell to keep each other on edge during long hauls. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. I glanced back out the window toward my truck. The wind had picked up, howling through the empty parking lot. My rig stood there like a monolith against the darkened sky, the sides still smeared with whatever had touched it. The trucker finished his coffee, pulled a few bills from his pocket, and set them on the table. "You said you stopped," he muttered. "You get out?" I hesitated. "Yeah." His jaw tightened. He looked toward the woman. "He needs to leave. Now." The woman nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. "Listen to me, hun. Get in your truck and don't stop until you hit the next town. Don't pull over, don't check your mirrors, and whatever you do—" She hesitated. "If you hear something, don't answer it." My mouth went dry. I didn't ask any more questions. I turned and walked back out into the cold. The wind whipped against my face as I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. My fingers hovered over my phone, debating whether to call someone, anyone, but I had no idea what I would even say. Instead, I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pulled out onto the highway. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. The first hour passed without incident. Then, somewhere in the distance, through the hum of my tires and the faint whistle of the wind, I heard it. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not at the door, at the window. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. My entire body locked up as the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I pressed down on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed, 60, 70, 80, but the knocks didn't stop. Then, a voice, a whisper, low, familiar. "Driver, you forgot something." My stomach twisted into knots. It was my own voice. I clenched my jaw, staring straight ahead. The whisper came again, closer. "Let us in." I did the only thing I could do. I floored it, gripping the wheel as the truck roared down the empty highway, the shadows stretching long in my mirrors. The knocking faded. The whispers stopped. But I didn't stop driving. I never took that route again. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm miles from the nearest town, I swear I still hear it. A voice, just outside the window, asking to come in. I had been driving for nearly 16 hours straight, my eyelids heavy, my fingers stiff against the wheel, as I pulled into the empty lot of the meet and turn stop, somewhere in Oklahoma. It was close to 3 a.m., and the place was nothing more than an old, cracked parking lot next to a stretch of desolate road, lit only by a single flickering street lamp. The nearest town was miles away, and the truck stop I had passed about an hour ago was the last sign of civilization I had seen. Normally, I'd wait here for another driver, transfer my load, and then head back west. But I had arrived early, which meant I had at least an hour to kill before the other trucker showed up. The lot was empty, just rows of faded white lines marking spaces that hadn't seen much use in years. I pulled my rig into the closest spot and turned off the engine, the sudden silence swallowing me whole. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind whipping across the asphalt and the occasional creak of my truck settling. I leaned my seat back, stretching my sore muscles, and let out a long breath. Just a short nap, just enough to recharge before the drive back. I adjusted my cap over my eyes, let the distant hum of cicadas lull me into a light sleep, and was almost out when I heard it. A barking dog. It was distant at first, barely a murmur over the sound of the wind, but then it grew louder, sharper, agitated. I furrowed my brows, lifting my cap slightly, listening. It sounded like it was getting closer. Deep, guttural barking, angry and relentless, like it had cornered something. I sat up fully, glancing out the windshield, but the lot was still empty. Just my rig and the wide stretch of black pavement. There were no houses nearby, no farms, no reason for a dog to be out here in the middle of nowhere. I swallowed hard and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was a stray. Maybe it had wandered too far from wherever it belonged. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't the typical barking of a lost dog. It was guttural, desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in around me like a weight. I sat there, frozen, listening. Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind and the distant hum of the highway beyond the trees. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. Just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I reached for the thermos of coffee sitting in the cup holder, took a sip, and nearly choked when something slammed against my passenger door. My heart stopped. A sharp, deliberate bang against the metal. My pulse spiked as I jerked toward the noise, my fingers clenching the wheel. The cab light flickered slightly from the force of it. I turned, slowly, eyes locked on the window, but all I could see was darkness. My headlights were off. The street lamp barely illuminated the pavement. The edges of the lot faded into nothing but ink-black void. I leaned forward slightly, squinting, trying to see if anything was moving out there. Maybe it was the dog. Maybe it had gotten close enough to jump up, slam into the side of my truck. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't right. It hadn't sounded like paws. It had sounded like knuckles, like a hand. I stayed still, my breath shallow, my ears straining for any sign of movement. And then, from just outside the passenger door, barely above a whisper, "Hey, can you let me in?" My blood went ice cold. It wasn't a dog. It was a man. Or at least, it sounded like a man. His voice was hoarse, raspy, like he had been screaming for hours. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice not to shake. "Who's there?" Silence. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Something wasn't right. No one should have been out here. I hadn't seen another car for miles. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling slightly, and turned on the screen. No service. My heart pounded harder. I checked the locks on the doors. Secure. Still, the voice came again, closer this time. "I need a ride." It was wrong. Too close now, as if he had pressed his face right up against the window. My gut twisted violently. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the ignition, ready to start the truck and get the hell out of there. But then I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Something shifted, not outside, not on the pavement, but right next to me, in the passenger seat. My breath caught in my throat. A shape, a figure, sitting in the seat, its form just barely visible in the dim light of the dashboard. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I turned my head ever so slightly, my entire body locking up in fear. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything. Its head was wrong. Too long, too stretched, almost distorted. Its skin was dark and mottled, like bruised flesh left too long in the sun. And then, Before my mind could even process what I was looking at, it grinned. I don't remember starting the truck. I don't remember throwing it into gear. I just remember the tires screeching as I floored it, the entire rig shuddering as I tore out of the lot, the headlights flooding the pavement with harsh white light. I didn't look at the passenger seat. I wouldn't. My hands trembled violently against the wheel as I merged back onto the highway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty, and for a brief moment, I thought I had escaped. But then, from the CB radio, a crackle, a pause, and then, in my own voice, "Hey, can you let me in?" I shut the radio off. I never used that meet and turn lot again, and to this day, I refuse to stop my truck for anyone. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't looking for a ride. It was looking for a way in. My name is James, and I've been driving trucks for over 20 years. I've seen a lot on the road. Crazy accidents, strange folks at truck stops, eerie patches of highway where it feels like you're the last person left in the world. But nothing has ever shaken me like what happened in Nebraska 6 years ago. It was a standard overnight haul, nothing special, just another long stretch of open road. I was dead tired, but had about another 2 hours before I could pull off and sleep. The highway was deserted, no cars in sight, just endless black asphalt stretching into the void. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional mile marker reflecting back at me. I had my radio on low, just enough to fill the silence, but my eyelids were getting heavy, my body begging for rest. That's when I saw him. A man, standing on the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere. I barely caught him in the edge of my headlights, tall, thin, wearing a black jumpsuit or something like it. He wasn't waving, wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still. I didn't slow down, didn't even think about stopping, but the sight of him sent ice through my veins. I gripped the wheel tighter, watching him disappear into my mirrors as I blew past. Something about the way he stood there, the way he just was, unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I shook it off, figuring it was just some drifter, or maybe a hitchhiker who had given up on getting a ride. But then, about 10 minutes later, I saw him again. My stomach twisted into knots. There, just outside my headlights' reach, the same damn man. Same black jumpsuit, same eerie, motionless stance. This time, I could see him better. His face was pale, almost grey, his eyes too large for his head, and he didn't seem to blink. My hands tightened on the wheel. It wasn't possible. I hadn't passed any side roads, no cars had gone by, and there was no way he could have run that distance in just a few minutes. My brain screamed for logic, for some kind of rational explanation, but deep down, I knew. I wasn't alone on this stretch of road anymore. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I told myself I was just exhausted, seeing things. Sleep deprivation can do that, right? I swallowed hard and pushed on, determined to reach the next truck stop and shake this feeling. But then, something changed. My radio crackled. Static buzzed through the speakers, loud and sharp, drowning out the music I had playing. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest as a voice, flat, monotone, wrong, came through. "Driver, pull over." I stared at the radio in disbelief, my entire body going rigid. The voice wasn't a dispatcher, wasn't another trucker. It didn't even sound human. It was hollow, distorted, like something trying to mimic a human voice, but not quite getting it right. I reached for the dial, twisting it off, but the voice kept going. "Pull over. We need to talk." I slammed my fist against the dashboard. "Hell no." The static screeched and then silence. Just as I thought it was over, my headlights flickered. The truck lurched. The dashboard lights dimmed for just a second, like the power had flickered, but that shouldn't have been possible. I checked my mirrors instinctively, and that's when my stomach dropped. The man was standing in the middle of the road behind me, dead center, unmoving. But this time, he was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across his too pale face, his eyes still unblinking, staring straight into my mirrors. My body locked up in pure terror. I hit the gas harder, my speed climbing. 80, 85, 90. The truck roared forward, but my pulse was roaring even louder. I had to get the hell out of here. I kept my eyes locked forward, refusing to check the mirrors again. But then, a tap, a slow, deliberate tap on the glass beside me. My breath caught in my throat. No, that wasn't possible. I was going 90 miles per hour. There was no way. My peripheral vision caught something. A shape, a figure, hanging onto the side of my truck. I don't know how, I don't know what it was, but it was there, just outside my window. I felt it, the presence, the weight of something clinging to the metal frame of my cab, its fingers dragging against the glass. I knew. If I looked, I would see that face, that terrible, grinning face. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the truck steady. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. And then, the tap came again, slower this time, and a whisper, faint but clear. Pull over. I don't know how I made it through that stretch of highway. I don't know how I kept driving, but somehow I did. I focused on the road, on the distant glow of the next town, and I refused to look. The tapping stopped. The whisper faded, and just as, suddenly, as it had begun, the pressure in the air lifted. The headlights stopped flickering. My mirrors were empty. I hit the truck stop doing 60, skidding into a parking space so fast I nearly jackknifed. I threw open the door, jumped down, and collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. The lot attendant came running over, eyes wide. "Jesus, driver, you all right?" I couldn't answer. I just sat there, shaking, staring at the truck, waiting for him to appear again. But there was nothing. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there at all. Just me and my rig.